Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 89, The Calm Before the War. Last time, we saw Antiochus III finally get over his dithering and land in mainland Greece with an army. Let's see how the Romans respond to this, even if he was invited in by the Aetolian League. Along the way, we'll let our Roman historian Livy tell us about the eyeballing and manoeuvring that went on in this early phase of the conflict. Now, Antiochus may have been in Greece, but he wasn't in an ideal position. The army he had brought with him was barely sizable enough to keep Greece, even if there had been nothing protecting it from Seleucid incursions. Waging war on Rome would be a different level of challenging. Moreover, his crossing had occurred when winter was setting in. Essentially, he was now isolated in Greece until spring arrived, and basically dependent on the Aetolians. However, this didn't necessarily mean doom and gloom. When these same Aetolians heard that Antiochus III had arrived, they passed a resolution with an invite for Antiochus to come and see them. Antiochus already knew they were going to do so he'd already marched out from Demetrias towards them. While at the city of Phalera, he got his official invite, and from there headed to Lamia and was lauded by the masses. Polybius writes that the Aetolian League had felt upset at Rome for the many insults they felt they'd suffered in how the Roman war with Philip V had been concluded. They had welcomed Antiochus III into Greece, and now they were willing to pay whatever price would come. Not only that, but Antiochus had actually arrived earlier than expected, meaning Rome was caught off guard and had no real presence in the region to respond with. That said, there were political questions that needed to be answered. Antiochus III presented himself as the one who would free the Greeks. This was the same line of argument that the Roman Republic had used about itself. If the Romans were to act sincere about this pledge of Greek freedom, Bevan writes, how could they then take issue with Antiochus III being there? Could a hypothetically free people not show friendship to both sides? The political reality, however, was that what both sides meant by freedom was that the Greeks would be subordinate to them. But anyway, back to the Aetolian League. Antiochus was invited to speak at one of the League's meetings. During his speech, he apologized for how small his army was. He knew the Aetolians had been expecting something better. However, he argued that this should demonstrate his affinity with the Greeks. After all, he was willing to undertake much higher risks for them. He claimed that he had set sail earlier than he perhaps should have, believing that the Aetolians would see him and know they needed him to protect them. He then promised that, when the new year allowed the sea to be passable and calmed the winter storms, all of Greece would be awash with soldiers and supplies. Neither cost nor risk would be a factor in driving the Romans out of Greece. Not only that, but the Aetolian League would be at the forefront of an independent Greece. Antiochus finished his speech to raucous approval and then left the assembly. A dispute promptly broke out between the two preeminent men in the League, called Thoas and Phineas. Phineas was of the opinion that Antiochus should be the one to restore peace and act as a middleman between the Aetolian League and the Romans. After all, his imperial presence would act as a mollifying factor. The Romans surely weren't going to try anything with the Seleucid king in the region. For his part, Thoas believed his counterpart did not actually want a peaceful settlement at all. He accused his colleague of wanting to slow preparations for war, so that lethargy would make Antiochus hesitant and give the Romans more time to get ready. More to the point, he claimed that the Aetolians had seen evidence that Romans and justice were not synonyms, so a peace overture wouldn't exactly be a viable route. If there was still hope of a peaceful agreement and negotiation, as Phineas seemed to think, the League would not have contacted the Seleucid king in the first place. Thoas suggested that they should double down, even if Antiochus had showed up ahead of schedule. They should request that Antiochus get the rest of his army and navy in the region. Military might was all that would carry the day. This opinion won out, and Antiochus was voted the position of commander. An advisory body of 30 Aetolians was also selected for the king. With that, the meeting broke up properly. The next day, Antiochus III met with these 30 men. A decision was made that the first step should be to advance on Chalkis. Speed was crucial here, so Antiochus left with just 1,000 men, while the Aetolians took another road with a select few of their forces. Once these forces drew near to the city, Chalkis' notables and magistrates headed out in front of the gate. There was then a meeting held between the two sides. The Aetolian League pressed Chalkis to ally themselves with Antiochus, while not abandoning friendly relations with the Roman Republic. Antiochus was here as a peaceful liberator, not a warrior. The argument ran that the best course for Greece, and thus Chalkis, was to be friendly to both sides. However, there's a real carrot-and-stick approach here. This is because Chalkis was gently reminded that, should they refuse, the Roman Republic was far away and Antiochus was here right now with all the pointy things. One Chalkis man got the bright idea to muse whom exactly Antiochus was freeing, as he'd not heard of any Greek city which had a Roman garrison imposed upon it. He stated that Chalkis did not spurn the king, but they were free and did not need protecting or a liberator. That said, the Aetolians were not about to be let in, so they should back off. A polite but firm no, in other words. This news came back to the king at his fleet. He had been waiting there since his bare-bones army would not have been enough to force the issue as of yet. And you can imagine, because of this, he retreated back to Demetrias and consulted again. Overtures were next made to the Boeotians, Athamanes, and Achaeans. By the way, Boeotia is a region in the middle of modern-day Greece. The Boeotians were predicted to be hostile to Rome, and the Achaean leader was thought to have a personal dislike for Titus Quinctius Flaminius. Remember, he's our Roman man in Greece. Finally, the king of the Athamanes was married to a lady called Apama. This Apama was the daughter of Alexander of Megalopolis, and claimed that she was descended from Alexander the Great. To really drive this point home, her two sons were named Alexander and Philip, while their daughter was Apama Jr. This is the most information I could find out about this family tree, by the way, but I assume it's in some way connected via that fictional genealogy claiming descent from Darius III we've discussed before on this podcast. Now, Apama Senior's brother Philip was also a self-important man, and the pro-Seleucid side had hinted to him that the throne of Macedon might be made vacant for him. After all, he was royal. If only his brother-in-law would side with them, they couldn't lose. This strategy worked on both Philip and the king of the Achaeans. We now get a meeting between the Seleucid side and Flaminius at Aegium in the Achaean League. The Seleucid delegate boasted with empty words about the vast host that was waiting to cross the sea, including cataphracts and horse archers who could fire backwards as they rode off. Now, this tactic sounds a bit like what I was taught as a child about the tactic of the Parthians. Who knows, maybe this means that Antiochus III had some Parthians in his armies. My suspicion in this regard is somewhat confirmed by the fact that the Dahae are mentioned among the tribes the representative threw in there to frighten the Romans with. We mentioned the Dahae back when we were discussing the Parthians back in episode 42. The delegate also argued that the Romans weren't facing a Philip V or a Hannibal now, they were playing against the big boys. This is the Seleucid monarch we're talking about. The Aetolians added to this, begging the Romans to just consider a peaceful solution. Not that all of this worked very well, as the Aetolian representative often fell back on petty insults to Flaminius himself. For his part, Flaminius coolly remarked that, essentially, the Aetolians were all bark and no bite. And anyway, it was clear by the mutually exclusive lies the representatives were engaging in that they were not as strong as they claimed. One side was boasting about the Aetolian might in putting down Philip V of Macedon, while the other was boasting of a king from across the sea who was going to bring the real power. Essentially, which is it? Sort your stories out, who's got the power here? I guess the two must not have compared notes beforehand. Flaminius also remarked that all those tribes getting mentioned by the Seleucid representative were little better than slaves. Flaminius then told a story to parallel this impressive list. It was a tale of a man who boasted to his friends of all varieties of meat he had to offer them, but it transpired that they all derived in some way from just a pig. This myriad of names hid that all of these tribes were, essentially, Syrians, Flaminius said. He ended by essentially telling them to bring it on. Flaminius now formally declared war on Antiochus and the Aetolians, and garrisons were sent into Chalcis and Piraeus, the harbour of Athens. The city of Athens itself had been in a febrile mood before this point. One man had recommended heading to the Seleucid side, but the other side called Flaminius in, and the man was tried, sentenced, and exiled. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic side of things, the response came back from the Achaeans and the Boeotians, but they were both either non-committal or cold in response to Antiochus's overtures. Antiochus III now found out that both the Roman Republic and Eumenes II of Pergamon had sent forces to Chalcis. So he decided to act. That's where we'll leave it for today's episode. As always, thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to get in touch at the show's email address, which, as a reminder, is afteralexpod@gmail.com. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.